Hey, what's up, everybody? Steve Schwartz here from LSAT Unplugged, joining you today to share the details on 3 big news stories that have broken over the past few weeks. So, the 3 news stories. First off, 9 of the top 14 law schools have dropped out of the U.S. news rankings. Secondly, the American Bar Association voted to stop requiring that law schools use exams like the LSAT for admissions. And finally, third, LSAC has moved forward with its plans to change or remove the logic games section, likely starting in 2024. First off, law schools dropping out of the U.S. news rankings. What's going on there? Last week, Yale announced it was dropping out of the U.S. news rankings in protest of how U.S. News conducts the rankings, with particular regard to its impact on merit-based scholarship money, as well as how the rankings count public interest fellowships. Yale was followed by Harvard, then Berkeley, Georgetown, Columbia, Stanford, University of Michigan, Northwestern, and Duke. Those 9 schools all dropped out of the U.S. news rankings in the span of less than 1 week. What is going on there? A couple of things. Firstly, and this was not explicitly stated in any of the schools' public statements, I believe these schools are dropping out of the rankings in an effort to preserve race-based affirmative action, despite the fact that the Supreme Court will likely ban this practice next year. The law schools talked about diversity. They talked about the fact that the rankings incentivize schools to overemphasize LSAT and GPA in the admissions process, which hampers diversity. So if the schools are looking to potentially de-emphasize the role of LSAT and GPA in the admissions process and increase the emphasis on more soft factors, that will allow the schools to preserve racial diversity of their classes. However, of course, law schools will still want to keep their LSAT and GPA medians up because this information is publicly available and U.S. News can still rank schools whether they want this to be ranked or not. So I do believe that the schools are saying vocally, we're looking to de-emphasize LSAT and GPA. So if you see our medians dropping, if you see us maintaining the current ratios of members of different races in our entering classes, this doesn't really mean we're practicing affirmative action. It just means that we don't care as much about LSAT and GPA as we used to. Why else would Yale and Harvard and others make such public statements about this? And why now? This, I believe, is a main reason, a primary reason the schools are taking action like this now. Secondly, Yale, Harvard, and others did talk about the fact that the rankings incentivize schools to spend lots of scholarship money on merit aid, on merit-based scholarships, rather than need-based scholarships. After all, there's only so much scholarship money available. Money that gets spent on merit aid is not going to need-based aid. So in other words, schools are essentially buying their places in the rankings by giving out merit aid to students with LSAT scores and GPAs above the school's current median. If the school can attract applicants with high numbers, that school can raise their status in the rankings simply by giving out money. Now, up until this point, the schools have been competing amongst each other for the same limited pool of high scoring applicants with high GPAs. The schools are essentially now, I believe, banding together, forming a cartel of sorts to limit competition, to reduce this merit-based scholarships they're giving out, to keep their tuition dollars coming in. Why would the schools be doing this? Why now? I believe the answer may lie in part to the fact that there is a coming demographic cliff later this decade. What is the demographic cliff, you ask? Let's rewind to the year 2007, the year 2008, the Great Recession. As a result of that Great Recession, fewer people were having babies, hard economic times. Overall, the U.S. birth rate has dropped 20% since the year 2007. This means fewer students will apply to college in the year 2026, and fewer will apply to law school in the year 2030. Law schools are acutely aware of this. It is an existential threat to their existence. And so for any law schools that rely upon tuition dollars for their revenue, they're aware of the fact that they're going to see a 20% drop across the board. Obviously, elite schools may see a smaller drop, but still a real drop nonetheless. And this risks serving as another factor to decrease their LSAT and GPA meetings because there will be fewer people in the pool in general. And if they want to maintain their class sizes, they may need to accept students with lower numbers than they otherwise would have. Schools also don't want to keep giving out more scholarships than they need to. And one way to avoid giving out so many merit-based scholarships is to simply all make an agreement. We're not going to do that anymore, at least not to the same extent. And one way to signal that is to say, hey, we're not going to necessarily value what US News values in creating their rankings. Of course, the extent to which these schools adhere to their agreements remains to be seen. We don't know what agreements are happening behind closed doors here, but I do believe this is a classic form of price fixing in a higher education context. Now, news item number 2, the American Bar Association dropping the LSAT requirement. What is going on there? Well, up to this point, Standard 503 of the American Bar Association requires that law schools use a valid and reliable admission test. This test has typically been, of course, the LSAT. In recent years, the GRE has made some inroads as well. However, there's a big test optional movement across higher education and has finally reached the American Bar Association. This has been proposed a few times before. Each time it's been shot down. However, it's made it further now than it ever has before. On November 18th, the ABA's Legal Education Committee voted to approve the revisions to Standard 503, which would then remove the requirement that law schools use any valid and reliable admission test. What does this mean? It means that if it passes before the ABA's House of Delegates in February, which it almost certainly will, law schools would no longer be required to use any test for admissions purposes. There was a late amendment added to the revision to the Standard 503, indicating that this should not go into effect until fall 2025. So this change will not affect the current admission cycle. It will not affect the next admission cycle either. If you're currently studying for the LSAT, please don't stop studying. This likely will not affect you regardless, even in the year 2025 or beyond, because most law schools will likely still require the LSAT because they value it heavily in the admissions process, even if the American Bar Association doesn't require them to. Why is this? Because GPAs are of somewhat limited utility because there's grade inflation, there's variation in difficulty across different majors and across different colleges and universities. So law schools are not going to look at every college and university. They're not going to look at every major and try to guess at to what extent grade inflation plays a role, the variation in difficulty of different classes and such. But the LSAT is constant no matter who is taking it. LSAC goes to great lengths to make sure that tests are equated, that taking the LSAT in February isn't any more difficult than taking it in June or July or whatever else. So law schools will likely still keep requiring the LSAT, even if the American Bar Association does not require them to use it at all. Finally, the coming changes to the LSAT logic game section. I get a lot of questions about this. There's a lot of confusion. I'm going to aim to clear it up here as best I can. Back in 2019, LSAC settled a lawsuit with a gentleman named Angelo Bino, who contended he was at an unfair disadvantage on the LSAT logic game section because he could not benefit from diagramming logic games the same way that other test takers can. This is a fair point when you think about it, because, I mean, try to do a logic game section with no diagramming, with no aids of any sort. It's going to be quite difficult to do games in your head. So he had a point. As a result of settling the lawsuit, LSAC agreed to complete research and development into a new version of the test that would enable all test takers to take the LSAT without the current logic games section. They agreed again to complete research and development within the next 4 years. 4 years from fall 2019 is fall 2023. LSAC has made a couple of forays into that research and development already. In June of 2022, LSAC administered a new kind of logic game on the experimental section of the exam, and they actually uniquely disclosed that this section was, in fact, the experimental section. They said, hey, this section doesn't count. We're testing out new kinds of logic games. And so test takers were kind of thrown for a loop there, but that was an indication that LSAC is taking this research and development seriously. They are planning to move forward with a new kind of logic game. Then a few weeks ago, in I believe early November, LSAC announced that they would be conducting a field study in mid-December to explore, again, a new style of logic games question. This field study is open to anyone with an LSAC account who is not in the test prep industry, so I won't be allowed to participate. Unfortunately, I would have loved to see what they're coming up with. But if you're a test taker out there, if you're not employed by any test prep company, you can also go on there and see what the new logic game section might look like. It's a great opportunity to get exposure to a proctored logic game sitting. When the results do not count at all for admissions purposes, law schools will not see what you do. Good opportunity there. And again, we don't really know exactly when the new logic games will appear on the actual LSAT. LSAC will give plenty of notice about any upcoming changes to any scored portion of the LSAT. And don't worry about it. Don't worry about taking the LSAT with this format or that format. I can help you get ready for the LSAT regardless of whether it's the old logic games or the new logic games. When they do come out with the new logic games style of questions, I will, of course, update and adapt the materials in my courses accordingly. And I will aim to help you get ready for the LSAT, no matter what the format, no matter what the question types. I do want to recommend, though, that if you're watching this now or in the near future, you aim to be done with the LSAT before the new logic games questions appear on the actual scored portions of the exam, because currently there are approximately 400 released logic games you can study from, while for the new style of logic games, although I'm going to get my prep materials ready for you, there won't be nearly as much sample material to study from. So you might be at a relative disadvantage to those who were studying for the LSAT prior, using the old logic games, having those on their actual exam. So that's just my recommendation. Of course, if you're watching this 5 years from now, it is what it is. You'll probably see the new logic games, and I'll be there waiting with tons of practice problems and examples ready to help you out. Anyway, folks, that's all for now. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.